In this episode, I'm going to talk more about the empathy triangle and how you can use it as a tool to troubleshoot communication issues and to learn more about other perspectives. Hi, this is Dan Shuck at Glass Half Question. Have you ever found that you just couldn't see eye to eye with somebody? Or perhaps have you ever experienced a major miscommunication that led to an argument? Who hasn't, right? For better or worse, miscommunications and misunderstandings are part of the human condition. Practicing perspective is a set of tools and techniques that is designed to help with this kind of situation, or really any kind of a problem or decision you are facing where using perspective may help you with misunderstandings or the blind spots. The tool I want to talk more about today is the empathy triangle. And what I'd like to do is to show you how you can use this little triangle in a practice way to look at life's big and little problem situations. If you've ever seen any of the other recent Practicing Perspective videos, you will know that I'm very interested in understanding empathy. Empathy is fundamental and foundational to having perspective. It's also a basic human brain function. The ability to imagine and comprehend other people's perspectives stems from these ancient parts of the brain. We see evidence of the empathy brain function in other mammals too. Dog lovers may know this one. You come home and the dog has gotten into something he shouldn't. And the dog is already sad because he can imagine that you're going to be angry because of past experience that might have happened. Now there are lots of other factors in play, but you could not imagine your pet lizard or pet goldfish having the same kind of empathetic reaction to your coming home. Obviously, human beings have a very complex and advanced capability for empathy, but it's good to know that it's basically a biological brain function. Empathy is one of those things that you're doing right now, whether you're aware of it or not. Putting some focus on this can help with your perspective and communication skills. Remember not to mix up sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is built on top of the more elemental capabilities of empathy and adds a lot of cognitive interpretations to apply pity to the empathy to come up with sympathy. Sympathy is important, but that's not what we're talking about today. Let's stick to the more foundational empathy skills. Now, the empathy triangle is a way of looking at empathy, and I have some ideas for you today for how you can use this as a tool in your regular life. There are 3 parts to empathy. That's why this is called the empathy triangle. Daniel Goleman from the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence at Rutgers University describes this as a triad. Cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another person's perspective. Emotional empathy, the ability to feel how someone else might be feeling. And empathetic concern, any sense of interest you have on behalf of the other person. This is really about understanding your feelings in relation to the other person. Each of these empathetic abilities is distinct, and yet these are not mutually exclusive. There are obviously some ways in which these 3 types of empathy build upon one another. It's hard to imagine having emotional empathy without having at least some cognitive empathy to be able to understand the other person's situation. Similarly, one would have to think that you have some emotional empathy in order to have empathetic concern for someone. It would seem desirable to have some balance on your empathy triangle when dealing with someone else, especially in any kind of a stressful situation. But just because that's generally desirable doesn't mean that's the way things happen. It would also seem desirable that one's empathy across all 3 parts of the empathy triangle be high. It's very popular now to talk about teaching children to be more empathetic. Therapist Ugo Uche wrote an article for Psychology Today titled, "Are Empathetic Teenagers More Likely to Be Intentionally Successful?" And of course, with a title like that, you already know that his premise was that indeed, empathetic teenagers are more likely to be successful. Teenagers who are more empathetic do a much better job in embracing failure because there's little ego involved in their tasks, and setbacks, while disappointing, are rarely seen as failures, but rather as learning experiences about an approach that does not work for the task at hand. That's hard to argue with, and generally there's consensus that empathy is a good thing and something we should encourage. When we look at the level of contact we all have with one another through media, social media, popular culture, and just good old personal contact, the amount of empathy we each need to be able to deliver is at a historic high watermark. But in fact, there's been some questions raised about whether this is driving us to too much empathy. In a 2017 article on this titled, "Can You Have Too Much Empathy When Empathy Breaks Instead of Builds Trust?" psychologist Marcia Reynolds describes something called empathetic reactivity, when too much empathy is bad. With empathy, you will feel their stress, anxiety, and anger in your body. You might feel their pain emotionally and physically. If you let these emotions sit in your body and mind can be emotionally hijacked. Unbridled empathy can lead to concentrations of the stress hormone cortisol, making it difficult to release these emotions. Taking on other people's feelings so that you live their experiences can make you susceptible to feelings of depression or hopelessness. Yikes. So empathy is good, but too much empathy, especially reactive empathy, may be hard on you and may lead you to be ultimately less empathetic. I think the answer is that it depends. The circumstances clearly matter about how you show up with empathy. The parts of the empathy triangle you may need to use may also be different depending upon what we are talking about. You need to use empathy to have a good discussion with your boss about your work performance. You need to use empathy to have a good discussion with your friends about what they're planning for the weekend. You need to use empathy to help your 6-year-old niece eat her lunch. You need to use empathy to order coffee at the coffee shop. You need to use empathy to watch the news about people on the other side of the planet. The empathy needed for each of these could be quite different. But if empathy is a biological brain function that we are exercising without always knowing we are doing it, how do you know if you're using the right kinds of empathy for the situations you are in? You may feel like you are being very empathetic as you communicate in any of these circumstances, but what does that mean? How are you being empathetic? The empathy triangle is a practicing perspective tool for understanding your own empathy. Now, as I said before, there's no one-size-fits-all situations answer here, but the answer to any situation starts with understanding where you're starting from. The technique is really simple. On a piece of paper, make a triangle and write the labels on each point: cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, and empathetic concern. In the center of the triangle, write in one sentence about the situation you were looking at, like, I am arguing with my partner about money, or I am trying to help my son with homework, or whatever the subject is. You can find more about how to set up a practice perspective case like this in other videos of the Practice Perspective series. Now put a little circle at each point, and for each of these 3, you're going to rate your level of empathy. We're going to keep this very simple and use a simple 3-point scale. You might want to expand this and do a rating of 1 to 10, but I find sometimes those things can get too complicated and stop you from finishing this. So for now, we'll go with a rating of none, low, or high. For each of these 3 points, I want you to ask yourself, what is my level of cognitive empathy? What is my level of emotional empathy? And what is my level of empathetic concern? And then next to the circle, write a sentence or 2 to explain why your rating is what it is. This is important because if you look at this later, you'll want to be able to recall what your mindset was when you first did this exercise. Okay, cool. Now you have a little self-assessment about your empathy levels based on this empathy triangle concept. Now what? How do you look at that and tell if it's correct for what you are facing? How do you know that you aren't applying too much or too little empathy in any of these 3 areas? As I keep saying, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this. But there are some patterns. You should be able to look at the situation and decide if your settings are appropriate for your circumstance, or if you might be out of balance with typical patterns. That would mean that you could have some blind spots or biases in your perspective and perception of the situation. High level of cognitive empathy with low or no emotional empathy or empathetic concern. Well, that doesn't sound good at first. Having lower levels of emotional empathy may mean that you are not considering how the other person is feeling, and you could have some misunderstandings based on this. But in fact, there are plenty of life situations where this could be appropriate. Driving is a good example of where you need to consider the other driver's perspective with cognitive empathy, but not necessarily with emotional empathy. There could be situations in your work where you need to keep all business and where high levels of cognitive empathy are needed, but where emotional empathy really doesn't apply. Low levels of cognitive empathy, higher levels of emotional empathy. Although one usually builds upon having some cognitive empathy in order to have emotional empathy and empathetic concern, there are still life cases where low level or complete absence of cognitive empathy is a real thing. In general, increasing our understanding of the other person's perspective will help us better tune in emotional empathy or empathetic concern. But still, we can imagine plenty of situations where you might not have enough understanding of the other person's perspective and still feel very strong emotional empathy for that person. This could be a parent dealing with a child having problems at school. This could also be a feeling you have for someone in pain or suffering without really understanding their full situation. Neither of these is wrong setting of the empathy triangle ratings. Low levels of emotional empathy with higher levels of cognitive empathy. Now, we just covered cases where it's perfectly appropriate to be more focused on the cognitive empathy side, on focusing on understanding the other person's perspective and less about how the other person feels. When dealing with strangers and very tactical kinds of things like driving, this may be the best use of empathy. However, there are plenty of situations where this would not be a good thing. If you are dealing with someone close to you, or perhaps dealing with a situation where the other person's emotional perspective will be important for how they see the situation, then having a low or no level of emotional empathy here could lead you to misunderstand the other person. High levels of empathetic concern with lower levels of cognitive or emotional empathy. Empathetic concern is a little different than the other 2 points on the triangle because this has less to do with how you may be understanding the other person and more to do with your own feelings and drivers related to your concern for the other person. High levels of empathetic concern are just what we'd hope to see in a doctor or a parent or some kind of caregiver. But empathetic concern also shows up when it comes to being concerned for your boss's feelings about your work performance. It may come up as a way you feel about the plight of the homeless or the concern you have about what your girlfriend will think of your new haircut. Empathetic concern can, itself, create some kinds of perception biases. This can be especially true when the other corners of the triangle are low and empathetic concern is high. For example, you may have great concern for your child, but really very little cognitive empathy for what they are going through. Of course, there is nothing wrong with having that kind of empathetic concern, but it may be misguided or inaccurate if you don't have the other corners of empathy figured out. Lots of empathetic concern with lower levels of emotional and cognitive empathy can also be a sign of altruism, which is also not a bad thing at all, but can be the kind of thing that leads to miscommunications. The point of all this is that the empathy triangle gives you a way to assess your empathy on all of these points, and then to look at the patterns in the situations and decide if you need to adjust your empathy on any or all of these points. An unbalanced triangle is not necessarily wrong, but could be a sign that you have some blind spots in your empathy. Very low levels of empathy may be appropriate for the situation, but may be part of the problem. Similarly, very high levels of empathy, while generally a good thing, may be an indication of empathetic reactivity, and you should try to watch out for that too. We'll add this to our Practicing Perspective toolkit, and if you want to keep following along and learning more about these tools and techniques, be sure to subscribe here, and there's even more information at www.glasshalfquestion.com. But in the meantime, let's keep talking more about practicing perspective.